Greetings, sisters and brothers. Welcome to African History Club. I am your host, Milton Alimadi. Welcome to episode number 4. I want to start off today by reading a quote from Abdurrahman Mohammed Babu. He used to go by the initials A.M. Babu. Babu is spelled B-A-B-U. And I want to read this quote, which I extracted from the postscript that he wrote in 1971, and that appears in Walter Rodney's book, the 1972 edition of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the original edition published by Tanzania Publishing House. Here's what Babu says, quote, "To know the present, we must look into the past. And to know the future, we must look into the past and the present." I could not agree more wholeheartedly with the statement by Mohammed Babu. Babu used to be a minister of economic development in Tanzania during the 1960s under the presidency of Julius Nyerere, who is a renowned African socialist. He had a philosophy that he called Ujamaa, U-J-A-M-A-A, Ujamaa. It's a Kiswahili word, which could be translated into communalism, or as he put it, African socialism. Babu was a very close associate of Walter Rodney. They collaborated and worked closely together, and obviously that's why he wrote the postscript. Babu had a falling out at some point with Julius Nyerere and ended up spending a few years in jail and subsequently went into exile. He taught in the United States and then in Britain. Toward the end of his life, he returned for some time to Tanzania, but mostly he lived in the United Kingdom, where he eventually died. Babu, like Walter Rodney, were dedicated and committed Pan-Africans who explored the solutions, the possible remedies for Africa's contemporary predicament. Something that Samir Amin, borrowing a term from Andre Gundafrank, used in his book as well. This book is Accumulation on a World Basis. Is that the title? I have the book somewhere here. Accumulation on, let me get the exact title. Accumulation on a world scale, on a basis, on a world scale. That is Amir Amin's book. So he uses that term, and that term is the development of underdevelopment. That was his conclusion in terms of what is happening in Africa in our contemporary era. And all three of them also advocated study of history. They were economists in the case of Babu and Samir Amin, and an economic historian in the case of Walter Rodney. And all of them said that it is impossible to understand, to explain, to contextualize Africa's modern challenges, the issues that are faced by countries locked in the periphery in terms of their dealing with the countries that are in the so-called center, which in Africa's case happen to be in most cases, the former colonial powers, but not strictly so, because the United States obviously was not a colonial power in Africa. It has only taken the role of a modern colonial power in Africa after the decline of the European empires, particularly after World War II, when the economies of the European countries collapsed, were exhausted from the World War, and had to be bailed by the United States. So subsequently, particularly during the Cold War era, the United States also became what I would call a neo-colonial power in Africa. And obviously, Japan was never a colonial power, but Africa, vis-a-vis Japan, has the same relationship of a country in a continent or a collection of African countries on the periphery and dealing with Japan as a country that is in the center. And in more recent times, Africa's relationship with China has now taken that role as well. So whenever I get an opportunity to try to contextualize the history that we've been surveying over the last few issues of this podcast, I will take that opportunity, as long as I think it's appropriate, to try to connect the history with the contemporary era, even as we go along. So for today, we're going to focus on ancient Zimbabwe, not the modern state of Zimbabwe, but the original Zimbabwe. But let's start where we left off. We were on the east coast of Africa. We visited Kilwa, Mombasa, and Barawa, and we saw how the Portuguese, about 400 years before the scramble for Africa, the European scramble for Africa did not occur until 1880, 1900, when the continent was partitioned by the European powers. But Portugal was already engaged as early as 1505, as we saw, in the East African coast, involved in regime change in Mombasa, primarily to destroy competition. And we're talking at an era before industrial capitalism had set in the world and in Africa. Because as you know, the Industrial Revolution did not occur in England until between the period of 1760 to 1840. And that was obviously the primary reason why ultimately Europeans conquered and colonized Africa, to have that permanent area where they could extract resources for their factory from, and also have a captive market for the industrial manufactured products. But Portugal was already engaged in trying to destroy competitors in Africa in the early part of the 16th century. And this is critical, and it was not isolated to Portugal alone. Britain, for example, when Britain was the colonial power in East Africa, in Kenya, the British actually enacted a law which was called the Credit to Natives Ordinance. And what did that do? It banned the lending of money, finance, capital to any African. So Africans were prohibited from actually getting loans to start their own businesses, so that they would never be able to compete with European so-called settlers in Kenya. And I say European so-called settlers because obviously before the land was taken away from Africans in Kenya and given to Europeans, it was occupied by Africans. So you cannot dispossess a people of their land and call yourself a quote-unquote settler. All right, so let's return now to the east coast of Africa, and let's travel in a south direction toward what is now Mozambique. And when we get there, let's venture in a westward direction. And then we come to the area now occupied by the modern nation of Zimbabwe. But we're going back to the 11th century. And at that time, there was initially a Soto speaking people, Sotho, then at some point a Shona speaking people in that region, Shona. They were renowned for stone buildings. That is why the area was called Zimbabwe. More than 300 ruins have been excavated through the years. What was unique about these buildings was that they did not use lime mortars. There was no glue to hold the stones together. So the stones were held up just based on the positioning of each one of the stones. And it was quite a remarkable achievement. And at some point, I will read a description of some of these ruins from Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. There was some evidence of stratification in that society. And how was that concluded? It was based on the buildings themselves. The stone buildings happened to be located at an elevated part of the hills in terms of the construction. And the buildings that were further down on the slopes of the hills were mostly not of stone, but were mud structures, the traditional building structures. They were much more sturdier than the older mud structures, but there was still mud, and it was a clear distinction between those and the stone buildings that were built at a more elevated location on the hilltops. And that was to suggest that there might have been the formation of elites, which also raises the question whether the labor to build most of the stone buildings was coerced labor, either from within the society inhabiting Zimbabwe or from neighboring African cultures and African societies. So that was one of the things they were mostly renowned for, the stone buildings. They were also renowned for their trade. They also engaged in trade, and obviously they're landlocked, but they engaged with Arab merchants that came from the port city of Sofala, which is in modern day Mozambique, near the port of Beira. So they would conduct trade with them as intermediaries, and they traded with India, with Egypt, with China, and with Indonesia. And most of their exports, gold and copper, even though the gold locations were a bit farther from where the people of Great Zimbabwe lived. By their positioning at a central point between farther inland and the outlet toward the coast, that put them in a very strategic position to benefit from the gold trade. And that is how the area of Zimbabwe prospered through the years. And what were some of their primary imports? Porcelain, glass beads, lamps and lamp holders, and various types of ornaments. The people of Zimbabwe also engaged in pastoralism. So they were pastoralists, but at the same time, they were also farmers, and that mastered the skills of irrigation. So even though they did not build dams or aqueducts, they were able to divert the course of many of the minor streams in that area so that they were able to cultivate their crops. Now, at this point, I want to contextualize the issue of trade and Africa's engagement with the outside world. So we're looking at 11th century when an African people were willingly deciding the countries that they wanted to deal with, the countries they wanted to trade with, and the merchants they wanted to engage with. That was in terms of the external trade, and that was in terms of the internal intra-Africa trade as well. Both these trading patterns were disrupted during the colonial era, and the legacy still lives with Africa up today. Because obviously, when the continent was partitioned and divided amongst the European powers, the trading pattern was now a single route. The products, the raw materials came from a specific African country and went to a specific European colonial power. And in terms of the goods traded, that was also determined by the European colonial power. And the so-called imports, and I call them so-called imports because Africans had no choice whether they wanted the products or not. So the imports imposed upon the African countries, these were also determined by the European powers. And in terms of what African countries produced, that was also determined by European powers. So for example, during the colonial era, in French-dominated Senegal, the people in Senegal were made to grow peanuts. That was the primary product, so-called cash crops. In Mozambique, under Portuguese colonialism, they were forced to grow cotton. And people in Mozambique called it the mother of poverty. Why did they say that? Because you cannot consume cotton. And what happened is, during global collapse of primary commodity prices, for example. So let's look at during the Great Depression, when global demand collapsed. Nobody was importing cotton from Mozambique. Nobody was importing peanuts for oil production, peanut oil from Senegal. Now you have a people that have been forced to produce something that they really could not consume. They were going to get a little money out of that in order to buy food, which they have no time to grow because they've been forced to produce these so-called cash crops. I don't have to tell you what happened. Tens of thousands of Africans died in these colonies whenever the price of primary commodities collapsed, because that's what they were forced to grow by the colonial regime under severe penalties. In fact, in Mozambique, people who refused to grow cotton were subjected to corporal punishment, and they were also subjected to imprisonment in Mozambique. That was the production and trade regime established during the colonial period, and that is pretty much the essence of the production and trade regime that still exists in Africa today in the 21st century, even though official colonialism supposedly ended in the 1960s. But we'll examine this much closer as we continue with our series of podcasts, digging into Africa's history, but also looking at how some of this early history continues to impact African countries in the 21st century. We're now in the southern part of Africa, obviously, and from Zimbabwe, we are going to travel further south. In our next episode, we will be going to South Africa, and then from South Africa, we will go to what is called the Great Lakes region, which is East and Central Africa. Let me read a description of the constructions and of Zimbabwe and Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe was one of the most prominent of the ruins that's been located. It was enclosed, a, a collection of buildings enclosed behind a wall, which obviously was built of the stones that were set in place, as I said, with nothing to hold them together except the intricate pattern of the settings. So let me read from Walter Rodney's description here briefly. Quote, one of the principal structures of Great Zimbabwe was some 300 feet long and 220 feet broad, with the walls being 30 feet high and 20 feet thick. He also wrote, quote, the style of encircling brick walls at Great Zimbabwe and other sites was also characteristically African, in that it was an elaboration of the mud enclosures or kraals of many Bantu-speaking people. And finally, let me read from Rodney again. Quote, when Cecil Rhodes sent his agents to rob and steal in Zimbabwe, they and other Europeans marveled at the surviving ruins of the Zimbabwe culture and automatically assumed that it had been built by white people. Rhodes, of course, is the notorious, vile British imperialist in South Africa and imperialist in Zimbabwe, which he later named after himself as Rhodesia. And we will get more into Rhodes' notorious atrocities of the 1890s at a later stage when we are focusing on the period of European conquest and colonization. But I just wanted to mention him now since Rodney refers to him in his book. And while we're at it, I would also like to suggest that one way that Cecil Rhodes could atone for his crimes in the afterlife is if the Rhodes Foundation were actually to allocate all those scholarships to Oxford University rather than just dispensing them around the world. I think the most deserving recipients would be the people of Zimbabwe and South Africans, students from those countries. I'm sure you saw recently the major campaign in South Africa that resulted in the pulling down of the statue of Rhodes, who, like many of the imperialists and exploitators of marginalized, colonized, exploited people, we've seen many of the statues being pulled down now since the vicious murder of George Floyd here in the United States. Rhodes was pulled down actually a few years ago when South Africans, the youth of South Africa, decided to take control of their history. So they were a few years ahead of the rest of us. So the success of Zimbabwe also led to its ultimate decline, because as the wealth grew, the population also grew, and it put a lot of pressure on the land, and the quality of the land kept deteriorating. And at some point, it was not able to sustain the population. And people started moving away from the area. And ultimately, that led to the decline of Zimbabwe. And in the 15th century, another state emerged, another empire emerged in the region, and that was called the Kingdom of Mutapa, Mutapa, and the ruler was called Mwenu Mutapa, Mwenu, and then Mutapa. And to his followers, Mwenu Mutapa meant his lordship of over Mutapa, but to the people that he conquered, Mwenu Mutapa to them meant the great pillager, not a lordship. The kingdom of Mutapa became famous for its centralized form of government, and the Mwenu Mutapa also appointed governors to help administer some of his territories. And it continued to benefit from the trading routes that had been set prior to this kingdom emerging. And this kingdom thrived until the 16th century, when it too ultimately went into decline. Now, as I have been presenting my podcast in the last couple of weeks, I don't want people to get the impression that Africa was just about kingdoms and empires. Far from it. In fact, most of the societies remained either communal basis or territories that were governed by clans and by families. In a previous episode, we discussed the Kikuyu in Kenya, for example, and the Igbo of Nigeria. And we discussed that even though they did not formulate centralized forms of government, like the kingdoms we saw in Western Sudan, or the city-states we saw in the East African coast, or Mwenu Mutapa in the area of Zimbabwe, they had a very sophisticated governing system that relied on clans, that relied on secret societies, and they were quite highly developed in terms of their culture, in terms of ironwork, and every other sophisticated manifestations that we saw in the other African societies that indeed developed centralized governments and or kingdoms. And here I want to read a quote from Basil Davidson. I think he captures this sentiment well when he writes, quote, "The record of achievement is not confined to big political systems alone. In the shadow of their pomp and glory rest the modest but impressive achievements of village-level Africa, in community attitudes that joined man to man," and I might actually here add, man to woman, and woman to man, woman to woman. I resent the notion, but that's how history used to refer to all the narratives. It was man did this, man did that. So excuse me for this interruption, but I feel very strongly about it. Man to man, in a brotherhood of equals, in moral rules that guided social behavior, in beliefs that exalted the spiritual aspect of life above the material. The African village achieved a kind of social harmony that often functioned without any need for centralized authority. This, in fact, was where Africa best displayed its real genius in its capacity of social organization. It was a talent that operated at village level and in complex kingdoms. This brings us to the end of episode number 4. Next week, we go to South Africa. And I want to welcome anybody who's just joining the African History Club. If this was your first episode, I welcome you to come back next week, as I do welcome the existing members. And I welcome any other member that you refer and encourage to join as we travel through the histories of Africa to understand the contemporary conditions in Africa. And I recommend books that I already referred to in the past: How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, African Kingdoms by Basil Davidson, General History of Africa, volume number 4, Africa from the 12th to the 16th century. Editor is initial J, last name Ki Zerbo, Ki-Zerbo. Thank you, stay well, see you next week.